Hello, everybody. Good morning. We are going to start because we have a strict timing, as you know, in our agenda. It is for me a real pleasure to present to the next keynote, Abelardo Pardo. Is professor and dean of program in engineering at University of South Australia. He is the author of over 150 research papers in the area of educational technology and engineering education. He is also currently the president of the Society of Learning Analytics Research, SOLAR. In fact, I personally proposed Abelardo to be keynote in this EDM conference for building bridge between EDM and Learning Analytics Conference Society. And I hope that in the future, both conferences can be collocated in the same city someday. This is a call to Ken and to Abelardo. Now, Abelardo is going to speak about about contextualizing data mining in educational experience during about 50 minutes. So please, everybody has to wait until the end of the presentation in order to ask questions. I prefer in the Zoom chat, and activate your webcam in order that I personally will give the floor in sequence in order that Abelardo will respond directly in the speaking way via Zoom all the questions. So I give now the floor to our speaker, Abelardo Pardo.
Thank you, Cristobal, and thank you everyone for taking your time and share with me this hour for 50 minutes plus 10 minutes question. It is truly a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to all of you and to allow me to share with you a few of the ideas and a few of the research developments that I've been working for quite a while. As Cristobal mentioned in his introduction, I've been working now in the area of learning analytics for quite a while. I am now fortunate to be elected as the president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research. And I agree with Cristobal, one of the things that I think we need to explore a little bit more, and I've seen already even a paper that has been published in this conference, is the relationship between all these areas or all these different pockets of interest, if you will, and try to explore also, at the end of the day, the big problem we're trying to tackle, which is how to improve education, I would say. So before jumping into the bulk of the presentation, let me give you a little bit of context about where I'm currently doing all my research. As Cristobal mentioned at the beginning, I am currently at the University of South Australia in Adelaide, and I'm a member of this research center, the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning. It's a group of us that we explore how human and artificial cognition are used to understand knowledge processes and the impact in society. One of the things that I particularly like about this research group is we try to seek a lot of practical applications and impact. The other thing, coming from Australia, everybody knows is far away. It's a bit remote, a little bit more given the latest developments. And just to give a very quick idea of where I'm talking to you from, when you think of Australia, the first thing that probably comes to mind is Sydney. So no, I'm not there. I used to be there a few years ago, but not now. We're not here either. Melbourne is the famous place for the tennis tournament and the Formula One Grand Prix. Adelaide is right here. It's a bit like in the center of the continent. It's about roughly 1,300 kilometers away from Sydney. So to give you an idea, it would be crossing from one corner to the other in Europe. And that's a little bit the distance. So, and the other thing is, as you probably can imagine, we are in the middle of winter here. So you're enjoying your summer. We are now in the middle of winter. Days are short and dark. But on the flip side, this is the type of things that we usually wake up to in the city of Adelaide. And this is a picture that was taken a few days ago. It's cold, but some of the mornings are really, really beautiful. And this beach is next to the city. So we're very fortunate to be in this spot. All right, let me tell you very quickly the type of things that I like to share with you today. I divided them into 3 pockets. The way I thought about this keynote was not so much about me telling you things that you don't know. It is more sharing with you a common problem we have, a common challenge, and tell you in advance that I don't have the solutions. I just thought it would be useful to share with you some of the views or some of the angles that I have been collected for the last few years, and perhaps more importantly, prompt a few questions towards the end on how we tackle these issues. As I put at the beginning of the presentation, this is about discussing context and contextualizing learning experiences. I'll first give you a very, very simple data-intensive learning experience model, and it's just to make sure that we put the discussion in the same page for all of us. And it's a very simple model that has allowed me to bring a lot of different bits and pieces from different communities and help people identify with different elements. For this type of audience, it'll be a pleasure because we are in the same problem space. The second one, again, I'm going to elaborate a bit more on the importance of context, and from my point of view, is one of the things we've been struggling with the most. And then I'll just share with you some of my experience, some of the examples that I've been working with, and open it for you to give me your ideas, your comments, and share a little bit that, I wouldn't say frustration, but a little bit of that struggle with contextualizing learning experiences. So let me jump very quickly in this simple data-intensive learning experience model. This is a diagram that I've been sharing now for a few talks already, and there's nothing new in there. It's just a tool to help us get our heads around the landscape we're trying to navigate. If you walk through the numbers that I put in there, this is my attempt to together with some other colleagues, to capture the different elements of the landscape we typically face when we delve into research initiatives. There's usually a design. Somebody comes up with an idea about a learning experience and goes through a design process. There are some design constraints that shape the type of things you can do. Then that design is enacted, for lack of a better word, and it could be some other terminology, delivery, whatever, pick your favorite. This is a model and therefore a simplification or an abstraction. And then we have, during that enactment, a lot of interactions between instructors, support personnel, learners, a learning environment, and we're assuming that there is some technology mediation. Then when our areas are focusing, we are assuming that there is a data capture, self-report, or instructor notes. All these things are captured into a big bucket that we call database, and I left that completely and absolutely simplified on purpose. From that database, we perform some sort of analysis, extract some reports, and then those reports, the errors that you see there, are trying to capture what happened afterwards. Now, this is the first version of this model in which we made a lot of simplifications and a lot of assumptions, but it helped us, or it has helped me in the past, to try to convey just the landscape, just the elements that we need to work with. Now, whenever I propose this model, I intentionally leave out 2 elements that I'm going to show you right away, because this is the perfect audience. But as you can see in this model, there is no notion of predictive models and no notion of prediction as it stands. It's more like just collecting data, reporting, and interpreting. And this is to bring one point that in some scenarios, there is no need to have prediction, and prediction brings quite a lot of complexity into the whole problem. Of course, a more complete model definitely takes into account those predictive models, and also needs to reflect the fact that prediction relies usually in previous data. And that kind of covers a little bit the scenario that is so familiar for all of you in this audience, which is we have a lot of data that we capture perhaps from a previous experience. We create certain models depending on the infrastructure or algorithms we're using. We need to do some training for those models, and then ultimately we use those models to predict certain things that happen in a learning environment. But after prediction, there is usually some sort of reporting or results. And again, the rest of the diagram, I think, still holds. Those reports prompt some actions. Those actions may influence the instructors, or those actions may be directed to the learner if we have an intelligent tutoring systems. But the other element that I like to reflect a little bit more is that those reports, those predictions, sometimes also prompt some redesign, right? Like instructors or designers reflect on what happens, reflects on those models that are emerging, and go back and start thinking, I wonder if I should change some bits and pieces of my design. the final touch in this model that we've been added that has helped also quite a lot to help people identify the different elements is perhaps one of the most interesting relationship, which is this arrow that is going to appear on the screen, going from the design all the way down to analyze, predict, and influence previous data. And this arrow is important because some of the work that we have been doing for the last few years is actually to explore the opposite relationship, how a design influences how data is captured, how a design dictates the type of indicators that are meaningful, how a design drives the sense-making process when we need to do the analysis, or even driving the creation of predictive models. So like I said, the main purpose of this is to bring all of us into the same page. And like I said at the beginning, there is nothing intrinsically new here. It's more a reflection exercise to try to put bits and pieces together. The other thing, and just to share with you, the other thing that gets a positive reaction, especially when we show this model in contexts that are not expert in the area, is how it helps people to separate concerns and separate elements. Like if they care about having useful reports, they know that they need to have some sort of analysis previous to that, and they have to have some sort of infrastructure collecting all those observations. And it also clarifies them a little bit, where is that information coming from. So anyway, I thought this was a very effective way of making sure all of us are on the same page and all of us are with these elements in mind. The other reason why I included this in here, and this again is something that for you being members of this community, you are fully aware of, is that educational data mining per se, we may argue, belongs mostly in that a lot of contributions in the scientific that is about reaching out outside of those boxes and try to establish much more precise connections and much more precise contributions that are aware and they take into account the surrounding elements. What I want to talk to you about is a little bit my personal struggle together with my research colleagues, because in fact, all those elements already convey the notion of complexity. It's already a complex problem out there, but it's actually much more complex when you realize that all these things happen in a context. And this context, very simple word, right? The context. Once you start unpacking what is happening in there, once you start unpacking what exactly do we mean by context and what do we mean exactly by the word contextualizing a learning experience, the more you read about it, the more overwhelmed you become with the complexity. It seems sometimes that we're trying to capture here a very complex system in itself without the context. And when you bring the context, sometimes, to be entirely honest and frank with you, and a bit of a confession I have to make, sometimes that problem looks intractable. And this is a very interesting observation, because we may have the temptation of retract our activities into something that is much more manageable. And I guess part of the purpose of this talk is to try to explore a little bit, how can we cope with that complexity? How can we deal with that context that is messing things around so much? Now, before sharing with you a little bit of the latest experience, I'd like to reflect a little bit more, what do we mean by context? So I found this very interesting report that the Gates Foundation wrote at the beginning of this year. It's called the annual letter. I put the URL down there. Now, to put things in perspective, and one of the things that there's the data, I can see it now, it was published in February this year. One of the things that I started reading this article, I realized this is the Gates Foundation, right? So what we're talking about, it's one of the most powerful research institutions in the world. They have like an interesting budget, right? They have, look, 53.8 billion invested over the past 20 years. So we're talking about an entity that has quite a lot of experience in there. You may argue that they are not exactly a university, that's fine, but at least they have been focusing on very specific problems. And one of the things that caught my attention is that the driving force behind their initiatives is to put whatever resources are needed to achieve massive impact, which nobody would disagree, right? This is a really interesting and very important goal. It's not so much improving things, it's about achieving massive impact. And the type of budget you look at it in there is like, yep, that sounds to me like a very reasonable effort to achieve that impact. Now, The reason why I bring it here is because they tackle different areas. And in that annual letter, 2020, which was basically summarizing their achievements of over the last 20 years, they went one by one over the different areas. Now, the first one they cover is global health, very important, and perhaps one of the most known activities for the Gates Foundation. They created something called Gavi, and they tackled the problem of making sure that vaccines are reaching low-income countries. And the most important thing, and this is probably something that made them very happy, they can report that after 20 years, it worked. 86% of children receive basic immunizations. They are now addressing AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria. So in the annual letter, you read that report and you can tell this is people that are proud of their achievements, and their initial goal in global health was achieving massive impact. And the answer is yes, they did it. It worked. Then you keep reading the article, and the next area is education. And it's a very interesting turn. Then the document say, oh, the other area we tackled was education. And they start saying, ooh, success in America is a complexity equation, because they basically were after the same level of success that they obtain worldwide in global health, replicate that level of success in education in America. And you begin to see right away how the report starts saying, you know what, this is a little bit more challenging than we anticipated. And they start first saying, defining success is tricky. There are too many variables. Then another one that I thought, yeah, you see, this is very, very revealing. They would have guessed that global health would be actually much more subject to risk. They could not think that they would be very successful. And it turned out that education in the US was actually the toughest problem they were tackling. So here it is, Gates Foundation. Oh, I'm going to tackle two problems, global health and education in the US. And guess what? The tricky one is education. And they unpack a little bit why is, and the comparison, and again, nothing really earth-shattering for us, but worth reflecting on. Global health has lots of evidence, right? If you go to a country that has an issue with global health and you find a way of distributing vaccines, and then you increase the level of adoption of vaccination, then you can measure massive impact. Whereas in education, we're not just seeing this kind of bottom line impact. They were putting a lot of money, they are putting a lot of money, a lot of resources. Still, things are not happening at the level they expected. And these are, we're talking people here that are able to mobilize enough resources and knowledge and know how to observe massive impact, again, in global health. Another interesting point, they started to unpack a little bit more. How can it be? How can we be so successful in one area and not so much in the other? And they started detecting that even among people who work in the issue, and issue being education and increasing the quality, there is not much agreement on what works and what doesn't. And again, this is something that probably most of us are already familiar with, probably we already heard it. But to me, it kind of resonated that it boils all the way up to, it bubbles all the way up to this report of an organization that has spent so much money trying to address this issue. Another concerning sentence that I found in there is no consensus on cause and effect in education. And some of our algorithms and our models and our techniques, they dance around this area, right? We know that correlation is not causality. We also know that with the current techniques, there are certain things we can extract from there, but it is a bit of a concern for these type of organizations where they actually want to replicate things, right? So anyway, I thought this was a very revealing type of epiphany where in education, everything is different. Now, why is education different? And if we try to distill these things, and again, these are observations that have been already pointed out by a lot of researchers. We have way too many variables. And the reason why I include that in there is because this community, the same as learning analytics, we know what variables are, and we know the type of a struggle when we have too many of them. So might as well just put it as number one reason. We have way too many variables. And again, going back to global health, we may have too many variables there, but we still have a very easy way of replicating results. Whereas for us, to me, one of the elements that makes a huge difference is that context has a very strong influence on the results of an experience. In other words, two educational experience, two interventions that happen in radically different contexts may and are likely have very different results. The other difficulty is that the effects usually need to be measured in long term. Again, if we go back to the vaccines, you usually have a very quick way to measure the effect of your vaccination scheme, because you basically count the number of cases. Of course, it's not also rosy and so positive as I am describing it in the global health area, right? And somebody working in that area say, okay, yeah, I think you're exaggerating a little bit, but it's basically to make the point a little bit clear that there is a significant difference in there. Another very important point why education is different. It's very, very challenging to isolate single interventions, right? We aim sometimes for simplicity. And again, this is stating a little bit the obvious. There is no silver bullet in education. And perhaps we can isolate single interventions, but usually it's at the cost of not achieving a substantial difference. We basically start seeing small differences once we single out an intervention. We struggle with replication. When we try to replicate experiences, replicating means take one experience to a different context, and we struggle with that. And we see so many examples of things that work but don't work, or people that they agree that they work and people that they disagree. And to be entirely honest, sometimes we just find ourselves in the middle of the discussion. There is no clear answer. The other thing where we have to be mindful of, and again, this is perhaps one of the more important audiences that know about this, is that we have to make sure we're humble, we acknowledge this difficulty, and we don't get too excited when we see a technological solution, right? Try to avoid the typical, oh, how difficult can it be? They've been trying to tackle literacy and numeracy, but I have a lot of faith on computers and algorithms and predictive power. Well, this is a problem that hasn't been solved so far satisfactorily, and a lot of people are struggling with the content. So we have to be very wary of getting too excited. In this area, to be honest, experience, you see algorithms working so smoothly, I always ask myself, where's the catch? And sometimes it's, yeah, are you able to replicate this in different contexts? How localized is your result? It applies only to a special school or to a special discipline. We always have to have this in mind. And this also goes for stakeholder groups that are on the other side. If I am trying to find solutions to improve the quality of a learning experience, you have to be mindful of what's being offered out there, because sometimes, yeah, we see quite a lot of technological solutionism, or the tool that is going to solve all your problems in your school. Now, this is a reference to a very interesting discussion that happened, probably was a month ago, and I need to thank, this is Justin Recht from MIT, being so honest and so transparent in Twitter. You have the link down there. It's basically an account of roughly 4 or 5 years of research, and it was very interesting because it described the struggle, right? It described the struggle, how 5 years ago, him working with some other folks like Ilsicek and some others introduced certain interventions in MOOCs. These are researchers that have widespread access to MOOCs, right? So the first story was 5 years ago. They introduced certain interventions in free MOOCs. We're talking a large N, look at that, N equal to 60,000. And they obtained certain improvements, and those improvements, they produce very interesting results. The articles you see on the right side of the screen, those 4 articles are in chronological order, as Justin Wright mentioned them in this Twitter thread, which, like I said, you can access that in the URL down there, and I'll make sure I'll share the slides with you. Now, the second intervention they try to do is they try to replicate the value. A second intervention, I'm sorry, this one was N equal to 3,451. Still, this is not massive impact. This is large impact. Of course, we're talking a team of researchers that they have access to a substantial number of learners in MOOC, but they were not happy in the sense that they wanted to see if they were able to replicate this type of impact, positive impact at larger scales. So the 2 interventions that they published in these 2 first papers, then they went for the bigger scale, and they tried to apply them, the moment of truth, to all MOOCs from Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. So this is basically what it means, going massive, literally, right? And the bad news is that on average, the intervention don't improve completion. That was the conclusion. Interventions don't improve completion. So in other words, they weren't able to replicate those 2 interventions. They were so excited about it. Now, the interesting thing is that both Justin and some other folks, they started to unpack what could it be the reason why these interventions do not scale. And you guessed it, they started to look at the context. Where are the countries where these MOOCs are happening? What type of societies are the members of the MOOC are from different societies? What kind of features or what kind of element or variables are in those societies? In other words, they started to untangle the context. And the final paper, as you see there, which was published this year, Scaling Up Behavioral Science Intervention in Online Education, has a very interesting discussion about the type of elements that we need to be much more mindful. We need to start coping with the fact that context is a substantial amount of complexity, and we need to start to support this type of challenge. And one of the final suggestions they make is to try to design for this contextual heterogeneity. And to me, this is a bit of a warning, right? In the sense that, going back to my previous comment, if I run my experiments in one course, perhaps with 300 or 400 students, and my models come back fairly powerful, and I have a very high predictive power, I begin to be a bit suspicious, because I probably need to start generalizing or introducing lots of elements in my design to deal with the potential contextual heterogeneity that I will face if I go massive, if I can take that experience and take it somewhere else. So this is one of the tables that I've taken from the paper, references at the bottom, and all the highlights that you see in these slides that I'm going to show you next are added by me, so they're not in the paper. But this is a very clear way. If you look at this, at the column in the center of the slide, and then you look at the one on the right, you begin to see very, very quickly, without getting into details, how the betas go down. This is, I think, a very team paper. We have an incredibly talented team of researchers that over a period of 5 years, they've been trying to go for that massive impact, and they are beginning to see how things start evolving once you take them to that scale. And I think it's a very rewarding lesson that they share with all of us, and we have quite a lot of things to learn about it. You can find more details on the paper. Another similar case, and the reason why I bring it here is because it's a little bit close to my heart. About probably 8 to 10 years ago, I started to become a bit frustrated with the amount of engagement that I was getting from my students. And I remember at some time stopped criticizing my students for not engaging, and turn around the problem and start thinking, how can the experience that they are offered would promote bigger engagement. So I started to study a little bit more in detail active learning techniques, and at some point I landed in the flipped classroom. Now, and this is going back to that observation from the Gates Foundation report, right? The definition of flipped classroom, even though it's a clear one, it is in fact a pedagogical strategy, and some experts will say there is not much of a new thing in there. It's just basically making sure students engage with things before they meet face to face. One way or another, you still can find, like with any other technique, studies and rigorous publications that indicate, on one hand, that the evidence seems to point that this is clearly improving and have an increased performance of the student and satisfaction. But you also then find publications that tell you that no, our findings demonstrate exactly the opposite. It's not feasible, the students are not happy, results don't improve. So this is my way of saying that there has to be something going on to find all these reports for every technique or for every pedagogical approach out there to be in favor and against. And it's probably the context. And to be honest, this is the reason why I've included this in here, because being myself teaching or teaching in front of large classes, right? I could see how the context would influence the success or not success of this type of initiative. So again, it's something that is there, and perhaps we need to face it a bit more explicitly. Another interesting one, this is a bit more generic, not so much flipped learning. Flipped learning could be considered, depends who you ask, a specific case of active learning. If you look at simply active learning, you have very, very strong statements saying that there are very robust results promoting that active learning is actually good. But you also have studies that say, well, does active learning work? Maybe not, that's not the right question. So we even question that. And again, part of the reason why we cannot reach this conclusion or this agreement is because there are so many other variables, and everything depends. So to be entirely honest with you as well, over the years, when people ask me, oh, so you used to teach a flipped classroom, right? So it works. I immediately say, well, it depends. Or if they ask me, oh, this predictive model that you are developing, it works, right? Well, it depends. I always need to take into account that maybe somebody's trying to take that experiment and replicate it someplace else, and it's not going to work because the context is probably radically different, and we haven't been paying enough attention to it. So anyway, this was a little bit like offering a bit of a context or a foundation of the type of things that have been going through our head together with my team of researchers. Now, I'm just going to share with you some of the examples and studies where we have been kind of like developing that sensitivity for the context. I thought it would be useful just to share with you some results, a little bit of a evolution of how we've been tackling things. This is the first paper that we started studying about 2-3 years ago. And the reason behind this was mainly to start seeing the need to contextualize data. So what you have in the right-hand side is just clusters of events and the type of events we are seeing when students traverse certain learning experience. And one of the first thing I remember looking at these results and going, wow, yeah, this looks impressive. Look, we have, the algorithm has worked. You look at those 4 graphs in the left, and they clearly have different colors, which means the algorithm successfully managed to group events or clusters of events, different sequences, right? Different long tasking with the course coordinator and with the designers. What does that mean? What it means over time for students to do this? And this is when I realized that all the context comes in, and not only the context in terms of what the students may be thinking, but also the design, the context of the design. And you begin to realize that learning designs have so many bits and pieces and options, and even something as simple as how are certain activities presented to the students that affect the way they react. So this was kind of like a first call saying, these clusters are good, but they're not good enough. We need to probably be a bit more sensitive about the context in which these activities take place. So on the right-hand side, we did a little bit of a push. And again, these are very small steps, okay? I don't want to misguide you. This is not, or I wouldn't consider earth-shattering research. I'm telling you a little bit about these small steps that we've been identified over time to come to terms with the importance of that context. On the right, you see the clusters of students using strategies. Now, these strategies needed to be defined or needed to be refined in the presence of the design, but also of the course designers to really start seeing that, oh, okay, yeah, this group that we call selective is because this course in particular is offering quite a lot of options and resources to the students. So this course is offering quite a lot of choice, right? And students are beginning to select things, and some of them are very strategic selecting things. Some others are very, very intensive and they select everything. So this is a first glimpse, if you will, of us taking into account this context. And in hindsight, when I look back at these results, if we remove that contextual information, I can see how these results, if they're taken somewhere else, they say, oh, we did what you wrote in that paper, and no, we didn't find any selective group, we didn't find any strategic group. Yeah, the whole thing didn't quite work. And my answer to that would be, oh, wait, yes, but in fact, what we have done is try to bring all these context as much as possible in our study of all these students and all these clusters. So the algorithm or the result of that clustering algorithm was the beginning of the discussion. There was quite a lot of things in there precisely to cope with the context. This is another one that was very, very similar. Again, another study trying to detect the student strategies in a different course. Now, the reason why I include in here, this is because the type of structures or the type of strategies that we were beginning to identify, we begin to form or to describe them in terms of the design elements. When we say, oh, selective group, that's because they can choose a lot of things, like I mentioned before. Or a strategic group, oh, because the assessments refer to certain resources as the key ones that will be taken into account for the final assessment of the course. So then, of course, the students will react in that context. and become very strategic. And we start detecting what kind of selection criteria you use for those type of assessments. This is another one in a different context. Now, switching gears completely. This is how professional development courses, or how students going through a professional development course use video. And again, the labels there is no need for you to understand the data, but more the labels. We have people that are highly active, satisfying module requirements. Again, those labels are referring specifically at the context. So this course had different modules. Each module had a topic. The topic had a discussion. Those discussions were motivated with videos. And those modules had certain requirements. So we saw people adopting strategies that in this context, we could be define them as satisfying those module requirements. Again, a lot of discussions, a lot of exchange with the module designers, with the course designers. So we begin to realize that we almost like, we have to find the algorithm, find these patterns, but then cover that or interpret that in the context of a learning design. So after a while, what we realize is that, all right, if we want to convey this, it's not so much about presenting what we have found, it's presenting a framework, it's presenting something to tell people those are steps that are. So this is a publication that we put out there in 2018 that was trying to advance a little bit more this gap or this separation between, yep, the algorithms are good, but then there is some other additional things you have to do. And what we are suggesting here, as you can see, is quite a lot of emphasis on how the design informs what kind of data sources will we select, what kind of feature variables, what kind of supervised analytical model we're using, and always going back to the results, especially that last leg that says interpretation of the results. And we try to capture that in some specific courses and some specific examples. So this is where was our attempt to say, all right, if I have to give you now the strategy to replicate results in your course, this would be perhaps a much more effective set of instructions. The other thing we started to pay much more attention is to try to interpret everything under the umbrella of a learning theory. And this was also a very good our way of thinking. It's not so much just start thinking about studying algorithms and how patterns emerge, but try to reach out and contextualize all these elements inside a learning theory. Now, the problem with learning theory is that we have lots of them, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult to try to pick one or the adequate one or the most adequate one. And there are so many out there that, and so much debate about which one is the more relevant, that picking one in itself is quite a challenge. The other thing that helped us a little bit was, to get a bit more or a bit more around about the type of research frameworks that would be more suitable for the type of things we were doing. This paper by Peter Ryman, published in 2016, was very, very useful. He claims that the area of learning analytics and educational data mining, and in fact, and he bundles the two areas together, and I thought that was also a very good point. They have to move closer to this foundational research on learning, and he identifies design-based research as the natural framework. And I remember reading this paper and thinking, yep, I believe this is one of the elements that we were missing, which is this continuous refinement, this continuous discussion with the stakeholders about the experiments, about the context, and I remember thinking, this is yet one more tool that will allow me to widen the problem, to not only cope with variables and indicators and reliability and recalls and things like that, but also with these other multiple variables outside that are important. The other area that offered as another glimpse of the type of complexity we're trying to achieve is in another study a few years back, we started combining the bulk of data we were collecting with self-reporting, asking students. And this is something that also was very revealing, in the sense that asking the students, of course, you can ask simple questions that you can very quickly transform into tables that are easy to manipulate, but you can also open certain questions in and try to draw certain trends or factors that will give you a glimpse of that context. And we began to explore what was the relationship between those two buckets, the ones we were capturing automatically and the ones that the students were telling us. And we have a couple of publications out there that they seem to point in the right direction. Like it's a tricky way of mixing these methods, and it's a bit of a struggle because typically there aren't clear, I wouldn't say clear, but robust algorithms to mix the two, or perhaps the number of options is very large. But still, I think there is a lot of possibilities to start bringing that level of uncertainty from the context through self-reported data. And the other thing that we started to see is, all right, if there is a context out there, that context should emerge somehow. And one way of looking at it is also looking at what happens after we act on those data that we collect, after we detect the strategies, after we identify patterns, what happens with those patterns. So this is perhaps going a little bit farther along. We selected the area of feedback to see if data, and this was basically our way of saying, all right, if we extend those actions then to that context and then look at the reaction of the students in that context to that action that has been itself derived from data. So this is a paper we published recently in a few months ago in the Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference. And it's basically trying to unpack what kind of factors out there in the context are affecting or changing the way the students behave when we give them personalized feedback. And we started to get a glimpse also to some other contexts. In some experiments, gender was a factor that provides some sort of explanation. The fact that the students speak English at home or not, detecting things like mature students. And these are things that have been already studied and established many other people with MOOCs, right? So this is a way of, kind of like beginning to a bit more with the context that's around the experiences. This other one is a bit more advanced, and it's basically running focus groups through a subset of the students that receive those personalized feedback messages. And it was basically looking at their emotional reaction. And again, this is a way of trying to tackle the problem from the two different angles. On one hand, we detect certain patterns, we select the most adequate feedback messages, but now that the messages are out there, what kind of reaction is producing, what kind of emotions is it arising, and can we make sense out of them? As you can see, we categorize the reactions along two scales, activating and deactivating, and positive and negative. And one, again, and I need to be perfectly honest with you, one of the bits that was helpful, and we still have to unpack a little bit more, is that finding that using the algorithms to personalize these feedback messages is still most of the students producing them a sense of negative but activating reaction. Negative as in, I don't feel happy about this, but at the same time was activating. It was something that was prompting me to act. And again, trying to bring the context is, and this is something for future work, try to unpack which students are more sensitive or which students tend to be falling the category of reacting as activating from the comments, and which ones are not. So again, these are attempts to bring a bit more of that piece, which is the context. The other one that we also study is from the point of view of the design, and it's basically saying, all right, if we have the same intervention, but in 3 courses that have different structures, how much of a change do we see in there? This is a very interesting contribution because, again, we applied conventional data analysis techniques, and from the very beginning, we started to realize that even the first interpretations of the algorithms had to be contextualized. And this is my attempt in a slide to try to convey to you the variety, right? These were courses that were taught over different editions, and what would make sense in one wouldn't make sense on the other. So if you go to the top right, top left, we have different categories, how diverse were the activities. If some cluster was reading oriented, some other one was multiple choice questions. So these were courses that have multiple choice questions, whereas in some others, we didn't have multiple choice questions, much more about labs and submissions to prepare the lab and discussions and a lot of activity around discussion forums. So again, you may have an underlying common algorithm, but at the end of the day, you begin to realize that it is the context, the one that is reshaping these interpretations and bringing it to a point where they begin to be much more meaningful. This is, again, another attempt to highlight the different strategies that we see in the courses. And the reason why I include this slide here is that if we can do this with 3 courses, this is immediately telling me that I need to prepare something a bit more general if I want to replicate this somewhere. We have 3 examples of 3 strategies or 3 characterizations of how students traverse these courses, that they all have certain elements in common, but they are all uniquely different. One of them was a Python course, another one was a biology course, and another one was a computer engineering course. So 3, if you will, 2 similar disciplines, 1 different discipline, and still an underlying type of technique that can be expanded or can be extrapolated, but it's still very different context to elaborate and to analyze. Anyway, this is the end of the type of ideas that I wanted to share with you. Very quickly, just to leave you with some sentences or some thoughts for you to start thinking about it. Hopefully, I share with you my what we think sometimes a well-defined problem. Again, over the years, when I see that I run an analysis on a learning experience and all the models come back really nice and I see the patterns and I understand what is happening, then I begin to ponder, all right, how much of that is influenced by the context, or maybe how much of it I inadvertently included in my analysis, that if I try to migrate to a different context, then it's not going to happen, it's not going to work. The other thing probably to be mindful is those tensions that arise when searching for substantial impact, right? And I go back to that fantastic example that I mentioned, how those researchers describe the trajectory, the struggle to go from initially good results that show that interventions work to then take it to a massive impact and begin to see how that impact doesn't disappear, but it definitely takes a reduction. At the risk of stating the obvious, this struggle is not unique to the EDM or learning analytics community. Education has been aware of this. I think what is unique about our communities is that we come from contexts, or we come from techniques that tend to offer very reliable results, right? We can even share our analysis scripts, and incidentally, by Justin Ray, public those statistical analysis scripts before the analysis was conducted. So it's basically registering their methodology, which is a very good practice. Yeah, we need to be mindful that these algorithms that have that power, we need to be mindful that we need a bit an essential element of what we do. For me, the main takeaway is this need for design for contextual heterogeneity. And again, there is a bit of a tension of what are the initial steps? Where do you start? Can you start with a design that is already accounting for that heterogeneity? Probably not. And the tension is precisely that. Perhaps they start with localized small experiments, but as soon as you start aiming at that massive impact, be fully aware that that contextual heterogeneity has to be there somehow. And then the other main important thing, and this is one of the sections that I like the most when I read scientific literature in our area, is highlighting and admitting the study limitations. When I see a paper that clearly describes the study limitations, I get the feeling that the researchers have a good grasp of how far their technique can travel, or the type of elements that should be taken into account if this has to create some massive impact somewhere. Anyway, this is all I wanted to share today. Again, I want to finish thanking the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share these 50 minutes with you, and I'll be more than glad to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you, Abelardo. Very good and interesting presentation, and you do it in 50 minutes exactly. Wow, very good.
It's all about practice. I've been practicing.
Wow, incredible, incredible. Exactly 50 minutes. Okay, now we are going to start with the questions. So if someone wants to ask, please, firstly, you can write the question in the chat Zoom, only in order to have an order. And then you can activate, or that want to ask, the webcam in order that I can give the floor. Okay, so please write in the chat someone that want to ask. You can write the question, only I have a question. And also, please activate the webcam. If someone want to ask something to Abelardo. Okay.
I can comment on that comment that.
Yeah. Okay, Manolis
is
the first one. Okay, Manolis, where are you, Manolis? I activate your camera, the webcam, Manolis. Please, Manolis. Ah, okay, your mic. Okay, no, this is not. Where is Manoli Mavericks? I'm trying to look for Manolis in the list of attendance. Where is Manolis? Okay.
I can ask my question.
Okay, Ken.
Waiting.
Okay, Ken, start you.
Great talk, and thanks so much, Abelardo, for emphasizing context. So important. Actually, brings up lots of questions. A sign of a good talk. I guess one that I raised in the chat there is, given that there are tens of thousands of experimental studies in psychology and educational psychology and so forth, one element of the complexity is, it seems, I wonder if you agree, is getting our, developing our own expertise in and theories of all that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And in fact, perhaps one of the feelings that I've got through these experiences that I described is that we're barely scratching the surface, right? We're still not at that point at the level of which some other educational field, like the one you mentioned from Hadi, right? The 800 meta-analysis on feedback and visual learning. We're not at that level yet. We're not at that level of expertise, and perhaps we need to develop ourselves as a discipline, that type of theoretical framework and the type of scaffolding that we need around our studies, that yeah, we can start tackling that high level massive impact. I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm glad you mentioned theory, because it seems like there are existing theories of context out there, and it feels like we should be building on those and creating new ones. Like, you know, like our CLEAF framework is one example of a theory of, particularly of content treatment kinds of interactions. Are there other theories of context that we should be building on?
We have been working more on a specific learning theories, not so much tackling the context, self-regulation. I mean, indirectly, things like self-regulation theory or ACT, that would be theories out there that implicitly they assume the contextual information, but they do not have perhaps like a clear account of the elements of that context. Or perhaps another way to put it, they have partial accounts of the elements. Some of my the fact that learners are thinking about next steps, using existing content, going through those cycles, that is bringing an element of the context, but we still have quite a few social elements that are not part of the theory. So to be entirely honest, I do not have a theory in mind right now that will help us cope with that level of complexity. I think we need to start exploring that area, and perhaps finding those that are more effective towards what we're trying to solve.
Oh. Yeah. It is okay? No.
I think.
Yes? Manoli?
Next question.
Next question, Manoli Mavrikis.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Abelardo. That was really insightful and interesting. Maybe I think I didn't hear Ken's question very well, so maybe it's building on that a little bit. But I was just wondering that in general, educational research, not only in our field, but kind of broader, is not necessarily incremental. It's not an additive kind of endeavor always. Like sometimes, like, you know, research kind of either replicates things or goes on to do kind of like a breakthrough or something else, but we are not necessarily building on each other, kind of on past work. And so I wonder if in this nexus of learning analytics, EDM, and so on, if we have the ability to make this more visible somehow, and if you know any ways or efforts to do that. The Learning Analytics Hub, for example, seemed to be one of these ways of achieving this. And I just wonder, kind of broadly beyond learning analytics, if you are familiar with this idea or if there are any efforts on this. Thanks.
Yep. One idea comes to mind that I think we need to embrace a bit more formally is just trying to replicate the studies. And this is something that has been done partially in some areas, but I think there shouldn't be any problem embracing that a bit more. You know, there shouldn't be any problem saying, this was the intervention that was proposed by so-and-so in this context. We replicated the results in this one, and these were our findings, the type of variations we might expect. Being as we are in an area, and I agree with you, where incremental research is not so easy, right? Perhaps the one possibility is to be a bit more open to this type of replication studies, which some of them are already happening, and I think we see them more and more frequently, but perhaps a sense of maturity for our field would be to devote a bit more time, or to perhaps guide some initial efforts to replicate these results and just to unpack the consequence of that replication.
Okay, now Scott Harrison, please, you give the floor. Scott?
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much for the presentation, Abelardo. It was really good to hear you speak again. My question was sort of going to this vastness that is embedded in educational data and more to do with the variables and the measures that we use. Do you ever think we'd ever be able to achieve some sort of taxonomical structure of classification that would also then help us better understand the interplays of various contexts, and how context can then be better factored into, you know, sort of our causal inferences and what we'd like to achieve in understanding educational data?
Again, tough question. A few examples come to mind of very useful taxonomies, but also a few other examples come to mind of infinite efforts trying to come up with taxonomies that end up not helping. I think we're facing here a very ill-posed problem. So perhaps not something as formal as a taxonomy, but perhaps some sort of areas or classifications or broad context structures that help us at least to reduce that level of noise. So if I'm a researcher studying now my trajectory, perhaps be able to say, all right, there are 5, 6, 8 N families of context characterizations, and the type of experiences that I'm more about to study are closer to this family, and then start unpacking the type of contributions in there. But I'm a bit skeptical about full-on formal contextualizations.
Okay, last two questions. First, Violeta.
We have a comment here and a hand up from Neil.
Neil, yes, but Violeta was first. Violeta Calpaggi asked first.
And Sherry also asked the question.
The two last questions, Violeta and Neil. If anyone want to ask more questions later, can write in WOBA, okay? But writing in WOBA section, okay? So Violeta, are you ready, Violeta Calpaggi? Is not? So Neil, you have, I give you
Excellent. It's a great talk. I particularly like you bringing out that example of actually how the flipped classroom was actually reliably making the achievement gaps problems worse. It seems like we don't hear enough about such examples, and I think it's good for you to surface such things. Do you have other good examples that actually we as a field should be really worried about the stuff that we're talking about that actually might be making achievement gaps worse?
Well, a couple of things come to mind, and this is something that has been discussed at the level of in the area of education. One very known that I studied a little bit is feedback. The aversion to feedback in some instructors is because it may backfire, and it's again highly contextual, and the type of feedback and the mental state or the context around the student has a very profound effect on how that feedback is received. So this is one. The other one that it is a bit separated from my area of expertise, but it's fascinating to follow, is the discussion between conventional learning versus self-guided learning, right? And there are people that argue that discovery learning or inquiry-based learning in some context translate attainment. So to me, these are just fascinating areas in which you realize how the context is not just affecting, like it's not as effective as it should be, it's actually turning into a negative impact. So those are two examples that come to mind, and we should be very mindful of these type of situations because they appear fairly frequently in my view.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so the last question, Violeta, now is your microphone on? Violeta? Hi, Violeta. No? I don't know what happened with Violeta. The microphone is on. It's not possible. Can you write the question? Okay, I can read your question. I try to look for in the chat. Okay, here's the question. Abelardo, are there specific aspects of education research that you think we should be focusing on, in your opinion?
To me, the most beneficial aspect that I experienced over the years, and it's been very rewarding, is to always try to connect what we're doing in research with learning theory. And again, from my point of view, and being entirely honest with you, sometimes it's a little bit challenging to find that theory that makes sense for your context. But in my experience, it offers you a very good connection with what happens in that context. And it allows you to, like the model I showed at the beginning, right? It allows you to know the elements in that context. So the one that I used quite a bit in the past has been self-regulation theory, which I think it offers a very, I mean, like with any theory, you can find people that they love it and people that hate it. So you have to factor that in there. In my experience, for example, with self-regulation theory, there were a lot of observations and a lot of processes that we're trying to study that would fit in those models and fit in that theory very nicely. So to me, that would be my most decisive adoption. Make sure always there is a learning theory under, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense at the beginning, but again, it takes time. It is always a bit challenging perhaps, but in my view, it helps a lot to center the analysis and to make it a bit more down to earth.
Okay, thank you. Really, thank you very much, Abelardo, for your good talk, and congratulations. It is a pity that we are not.
Thank you very much for being with me in this hour.
Okay, but now the coffee break room session is open, so everybody can go to the coffee break session to continue speaking with each other. Okay, so I hope we can see this year in some place. This is what I could say now. Thank Abelardo. Need to see you. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.